Good morning. If you would, please join me in turning to the book of Luke, chapter 12. Belle Gibson was a young Australian woman who had a great sense of adventure. She had her future completely lined out for herself. She had plans and aspirations of great things she was going to do. Yet, all of that, in one moment, came grinding to a halt. Belle's sense of adventure was no more when doctors diagnosed her with terminal brain cancer. Meeting with her physicians, they said, "Belle, you only have 4 months to live. Well, we'll try to fight it, but there's really not a whole lot we're going to be able to do for you," and that proved to be true. After 2 months of chemo and radiation, there had been virtually no effect to her cancer at all. The tumor was still just as large as it had been before, and things looked really, really bad for Belle. But you see, Belle was a fighter. Belle determined within herself, I'm not going to let this beat me. I don't want cancer to define me. So she began to change everything about her from her core. You see, Belle began with daily meditation. She would spend time at each beginning of each day focusing solely on her mind of, I will be better. I will get better. I will remain positive, and I will overcome cancer. She began a strenuous exercise routine. She said, if I keep my body in peak physical condition, there's a good chance I can fight this longer. I can maximize my time with my friends and my family here on earth. And she completely changed her diet. Belle got rid of meat, junk food, empty carbs, and replaced all of these things with simply fruits and vegetables. She stacked all of the odds in her favor. And against all odds, Belle beat terminal cancer because she changed everything about her core. You see, we look at Belle Gibson and her story and we say, that's so inspiring. In fact, her story went viral, and it was so inspiring to people that she was empowered to create the Whole Pantry. The Whole Pantry is an application for people who seek to better their life by eating healthy, by having daily exercise routines, and it was a guidebook of how I can better myself. People across the world began to have hope. Over 200,000 downloads later, Belle realized she was changing people's lives simply because she took one step to change her core. Now, as we think about that, I'd like us to think about the context of where we find ourselves in Luke chapter 12. You see, when we think about the woes to the Pharisees that we studied last week, as Jesus speaks to these Pharisees and says, "Woe to you, because your heart is not where it needs to be." You and I become pricked in the heart and say, that's not what I want to define me. I don't want to be someone who has heart problems, whose attitude, whose motivation, whose outlook is not the way that Jesus the Christ would have me to be. So we begin to change everything about our core. And we wonder, how is it that we're going to make this possible? How is it that we become something we didn't think was possible? By changing her core, Belle Gibson became something she thought to be completely insane, potentially impossible based upon the words of her doctors. She became a survivor. You and I this morning, by changing our core, by addressing our hearts, empower ourselves to be something that might otherwise seem impossible, to become like our Lord. Now, as we think about that, we begin to look to the pages of Luke chapter 12, and we see Jesus speak directly to his disciples. He doesn't simply give out a list of woes to the Pharisees and say, all right, good luck. Good luck dealing with this on your own and changing your core. Instead, he provides for us a framework of principles that if you and I will follow, we will be empowered to change our core and to get the thing that really matters, our hearts. Now, as we think about that, I'd invite you to join me in reading Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. In the meantime, when so many thousands of the people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples first, Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now, if we start right here in this passage, we think about how Jesus just called out these people. He just said, woe to you because your heart is not how it ought to be. And we want to be different. We want to be people that stand out for having the hearts that we ought to. And this passage is so interesting to us because it teaches us that if we shift our hearts, shift our attitudes, shift our mindset to where it ought to be, it's altogether possible. And here's how it happens. As Jesus doesn't simply pronounce woes, but provides a guidebook for his disciples, for us today who seek to be the people who he has called to be. He teaches first and foremost, if you want to guard your heart, avoid hypocrisy. Think about the words of Luke chapter 12 and verse 1. When thousands of people are gathering around the disciples, they're gathering around Jesus Christ himself. And if we read the very end of Luke chapter 11, we see that they have ulterior motives, many of them. Many of them are seeking to test him, to put him in a difficult situation, to pose to him questions that will trap him, that will give them a reason, give them credibility for their hatred against him. And Jesus' words are so impressive. While thousands of people surround him with pure intentions, wanting to see what he's all about, wanting to hear his message and maybe become just like him, he looks at the disciples and says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Though that sect of people might altogether have been a small minority of the thousands of people pressing against Jesus, he says, understand the property of leaven. When you add yeast to dough in order for bread making, what happens? What happens to the bread? It rises. Just a little bit of yeast, a little bit of leaven makes all the difference in that bread spreading, becoming bigger, becoming something that is useful. Here it's used as something that is dangerous. Jesus says the influence of the Pharisees, as little as it may be on you, can have drastic damage to your life. If you become like them, in even just a small little way, you're in danger of becoming hypocrites. You're in danger of your heart not being where it ought to be. So guard your heart. Understand just how important this would have been to the followers of Christ. As many of them come from Jewish backgrounds, these individuals view leaven as something that is sinful, even evil. It represents evil influence because when it came to the Passover feast, these individuals always strove to remove the leaven from their bread. That way they could honor Christ with the feast of unleavened bread. When they hear that word, avoid the leaven of the Pharisees, they are immediately on guard. Don't allow evil influence to corrupt your life. Avoid hypocrisy. But he doesn't just stop there. He doesn't simply say, don't be a hypocrite and not tell them how to do it. He says, here's how to do it. Look at verse 2. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you've said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. Jesus says, if you want to avoid hypocrisy, here's how you do it. Seek purity. Seek purity. Jesus says it's so easy for us to slip into a back room, an interior closet, if you will, of your house and feel completely safe to say whatever you want. It's easy to remain in the shadows, remain hidden in the darkness and do whatever you want because nobody will see it. It's not that big a deal after all. Jesus says whether people see it or not, this influence of what is done in your life will corrupt you. So seek purity. Because if your words, your intentions, your motives, or your actions are out of line and inconsistent with that of Christ, whether it's known or not, one day your hypocrisy will be exposed. If you want to avoid hypocrisy, seek purity. Through your words, through your actions, and through your intentions, you cannot be someone who you aren't. Seek purity. Now let's continue reading verses 4 and 5. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. If we want to guard our hearts, be the people that God has called us to be, not to be hypocritical, not to be like the Pharisees, it begins when we elevate God. You see, this passage is so intriguing because as Christianity is beginning to spread, we see the disciples are faced with persecution. People like the Pharisees and the Sadducees who challenge what it is they're teaching. And Jesus is warning them of what they're eventually going to face in the book of Acts, when they would be faced with all kinds of rejection, all kinds of temptation to simply give up because of the mass rejection. What Jesus teaches here is a principle you and I do good to pay attention to. When we're surrounded by influences that try to tear us down, try to break us away from our faith, yes, maybe even kill us, in that moment, elevate the Almighty. Jesus says, don't fear those who seek to kill the body. Don't fear those who try to cause you physical harm, because that's all they can do. If you lose your life, so be it. There's nothing more that they can do to you. He says, here's who you ought fear. Here's who you ought respect. Respect the justice and the power of the Almighty. Respect the power and the authority of the judgment of God. Because though people might seek to destroy your body, respect the one who has power to cast you into hell. And here's why. If you elevate God with the way you live your life, if you praise the Almighty in the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you behave, if you're a faithful, obedient child of God, you have no need to fear hell. Jesus says, don't fear those who simply seek to kill the body. But no matter what circumstances you face in life, elevate God. You'll be rewarded if you do. Let's continue, verse 6 and 7. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are numbered. Once again, do not fear. You are of more value than many sparrows. Jesus acknowledges there are going to be times when you are seeking to elevate God, you're going to be rejected. But when that happens, don't throw in the towel. Don't give up. Don't back off of the commitment you made, and here's why. Remember God. Remember the love and the care that He has for you. This is such an interesting illustration that Jesus gives. He says, are not 5 sparrows? It might be better simply to say small birds. 5 very small, insignificant birds. Are they not sold for 2 pennies? For an amount that it accounts to nothingness. Yet this insignificant, seemingly worthless thing is not forgotten before God. You see, in this culture, when we think about small birds, sparrows, we're thinking of one of 2 things. Food for the poorest of the poor, or a pet for the rich. You see, when the disciples hear the word 5 sparrows, they're remembered by God. Something that the lowest of the low in our social class eats. Something that is simply a play toy for the rich, the elite. God cares for those. Verse 7. Why, even the hairs of your head are numbered. If you think the Almighty cares for the insignificant birds, how much more He cares for you, and don't you forget it. Even the most minute detail, the most insignificant part of your life, the number of hairs that are on your head, the Almighty knows, and the Almighty cares. You're going to face rejection when you guard your heart. When your heart is truly pure and as it ought to be, rejection will naturally occur. But in those moments, remember God and the care He constantly shows to you. Let's continue reading verses 8 and 9. And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. You see, it's here we see the reward of elevating God and remembering Him. When you constantly remember Him when that rejection takes place and you acknowledge Him before men. So I don't care what the consequences are, I'm going to serve Him, praise Him, and live a life that emulates Him. When you do that, when you represent Him before men, you can be guaranteed your reward is heaven above. You'll be rewarded for embracing your faith. That's the principle Jesus is talking about. Embrace your faith. Don't be ashamed. When you combine elevation of God and remembrance of His care for you, that it never fades, that it never goes away, the only response that makes sense is to embrace your faith in a way that it is not sacrificed, regardless of the consequences that you face. Embrace your faith, and you will be rewarded. But then we notice a very difficult statement to process from Jesus. Look at verse 10. He's just finished up saying, you can acknowledge me. If you acknowledge me, you will be rewarded. And even if you deny me, but change your life and begin to acknowledge me later, you'll be forgiven. You'll be rewarded for making that change in your life. But look at verse 10. Everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. You can be forgiven for speaking against Jesus, but the one who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. You see, we find ourselves in a very difficult statement from Jesus because Jesus is establishing this principle with the disciples. Evaluate yourself. If you're trying to guard your heart, constantly evaluate yourself. What he's saying to these people in this specific context is, you cannot be forgiven if you attribute the work of Jesus to that of demonic beings, to that of Satan. The work of Jesus must be given due credit. It must be attributed to the Almighty. But here's what you and I can think of that today. Don't neglect the Spirit's call for your life. For you and I, we must constantly evaluate whether or not we are truly living up to the call of the Spirit. Is our lifestyle itself a walking blasphemy against the Spirit because we are not living as we've been called to live? Acts chapter 7 and verse 51 would address this issue this way. You stiff-necked people, you people that are so resistant to change, you're always resisting the Spirit. To ensure that you and I are living up to having the hearts we ought to have, we must regularly evaluate ourselves. Are we answering the call of the Spirit? Are we living as we've been called to behave? Those principles we discussed from verses 1 through 3. What are we doing in the shadows? What words are coming from our mouth when no one is listening? Am I answering the call of the Spirit to live as God intended for me? Verses 11 and 12. When they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. For the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. I love the way that Jesus ties all of this back in together. He's acknowledged the reality that you will face rejection. And he says here in 11 and 12 that at times you'll be brought before rulers, before earthly secular authorities, and they're going to challenge you on what you're doing. But here's what he says. Here's the principle you and I ought to remember. Stay alert. Stay alert to the working of God and the Spirit in your life. Because if you are properly evaluating yourself, if you're not resisting the Spirit in your walk with the Lord, and you're trying your best to emulate Him and to live in a way that honors Him, the Spirit will work in your life. He'll give you utterance of the things you ought to say. What Jesus says is, watch, listen, Pay careful attention. Feel my presence in your life. Because faithful disciples will not be left to their own methods when the going gets tough. When the going gets tough, if you remember me and elevate me, I'll be there. Stay alert. I'll give you the answer that you need. It's at this point that Jesus finishes speaking to the disciples. And it seems as if in this dialogue with the disciples, when he's giving them this framework of if you want to guard your heart, these are the principles you should follow, it seems to be that he's interrupted. Let's read verses 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" You see, in answering this man's question, we find, in my judgment, Jesus giving principles for everyone around him and his disciples. It seems that he's tying a bow on top of all of what he's been saying. If you follow each of these principles and add this one last piece to the puzzle, you'll be successful in guarding your heart. You'll be successful in changing your core. At the very beginning of that passage, verses 13 through 15, when he's interrupted, we see a man who seems to misunderstand the identity of Jesus. He asks him to serve as arbitrator. Side with me. Judge on my behalf that I might receive this inheritance from my brother. Jesus says, you've missed the point of who I am. You've missed what my purpose is in your life. And instead, he says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Don't lose sight of my identity, and don't lose sight of me entirely because of the numerous distractions that could be in your life. There are going to be things that pull at your heart. Covetousness will get in your way. You will want things that you simply cannot have or should not have. But be on guard. Remember my identity and the purpose I have set out for you. You see, here's the principle that Jesus establishes. Dedicate yourself. All of it. Dedicate yourself in your totality, in your entirety. There cannot be one aspect of our life that is left out. There cannot be one thing that we simply hold on to and say, Jesus, I'm all in. You're my all in all. If there's one thing that we hold on to, if there's one thing in our way of saying, I am dedicated completely, we've missed the mark. Notice the parable that Jesus teaches with to illustrate this point. When he speaks about this farmer who's had great success, everyone that Jesus is speaking to would likely be very jealous of what this man has accomplished. He's put in an honest work. He's worked very, very hard, and through honesty and just good hard labor, he's had a great, successful crop. His harvest is wonderful. What he does is not bad. What he does in storing up his crops for the future itself is not bad. But he misses the point. Notice what he says. My crops, my barns, my grain, my goods. So you've got ample goods. Look how much good you've done. Relax. Eat, drink, be merry, take it easy. Look what you've done. And Jesus calls this man a fool. A fool. Someone who acts without God. Or someone who avoids or denies the wisdom of the Almighty. By simply being all about himself in just this one aspect of his life. His own livelihood, the work that he'd done. This man prevented himself from dedicating all of himself to the Christ. That one thing he held on to. And Jesus calls him a fool. He says, this night, your goods are not required of you. Your grain is not required of you. Your barns that you build, none of that matters. Your soul is required of you. The entirety of your inner being. The entirety of yourself. That's what's required of you. Dedicate all of yourself. You see, Jesus provides to us these fantastic principles that truly help us to remain on guard of our hearts, to ensure that we can say, Jesus, I'm all in. Jesus, I don't want to be like the Pharisees. I don't want to be tied up in hypocrisy, being someone that I'm not. I want to do these things. And when you and I avoid hypocrisy, seek purity, elevate God, remember God, embrace our faith, evaluate ourselves, stay alert, and dedicate the entirety of our being to the Almighty, we will be successful in guarding our hearts. Jesus says, rest assured, you follow these principles, you'll be rewarded. You see, when you and I think about the story of Belle Gibson, when we think about this woman who changed the entirety of our core, Jesus teaches us exactly how to do it. He says, if you make these changes, if you focus on these small things, your heart will be how it ought to be. But there's one problem. The story of Belle Gibson is a lie. Belle Gibson never had cancer. Belle Gibson didn't have any of the medical problems that she claimed to have. She fraudulently created this story, convincing thousands and thousands of people who have good hearts, who wanted to help her out, and people who were very seriously, terminally ill, that they had hope because she had a methodology that would make it happen. By living a lie, Belle Gibson became a millionaire. Her story is great. Her story checks out. It's something that inspires, but it is a lie. The difficult question you and I have to ask this morning is this. As we've gone about changing our hearts, as we've gone about seeking to apply these principles, is it possible that you and I are living a lie? Is it possible that we're truly not all in? Is it possible that when we're surrounded by groups of people, just as the disciples were in verse 1 of this passage, as they're surrounded by thousands of people, Jesus says verbatim, as you're surrounded by these large groups of people, it's going to be really easy for you to focus on your popularity, to focus on your reputation, to focus on looking good in front of everyone. And when you do that, the leaven of the Pharisees spreads inside of you. When you and I are surrounded by our peers, it is so easy to put on a show. Look how good I'm doing. Look how pure I'm living. Look how well I'm guarding my heart. When deep down, we're living a lie. Jesus says it's not all about your reputation. It's not all about simply just not being like the Pharisees. And it's certainly not about simply looking good. What truly matters is that from the bottom of your heart, you try with every step you take, every breath you inhale and exhale, every intention of your life, honor me. Please me. It's at this point we have to ask ourselves difficult questions to determine whether or not we're living a lie. What's your secret? What's that thing in your life that's done in the shadows, that's said behind closed doors? When you're out and about, there's no problem at all. I've got it all together. But deep down we know my heart's not where it needs to be. What's your secret? Step out of the shadows and embrace the truth. Who do you fear? Who is it that you respect? Whose evaluation of you are you so tied up in that it alters the way you behave? Is it the people sitting next to you? Is it the people that you work with? Is it the people you go to school with? Is it members of the world? Or are we so concerned about Jesus' evaluation of ourselves that it changes the way we live? Who do you fear? Where do you stand? When the going gets tough, when your back's against the wall, when your faith is tested, what do? Do you cower in fear of what people might do to you, what life circumstances might throw your way? Or do we embrace our faith and live for Jesus no matter the consequences? Do we embrace our faith or do we resist the Spirit? And the last question, which I absolutely hate the answer to, am I dedicated all in or am I a fool? Am I walking without God? Am I choosing of my own accord to step away from God, to step away from the wisdom that He provides to me and live by my own methodologies, to live by my own means because my goods, my grain, my barn? Relax. Am I a fool or am I all in? If Jesus Christ were here with you and I this morning, could we look Him in the face and say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Lord, You are my all in all? Are you living a lie this morning? At times we've all become guilty of it, but it could be that as you think about Jesus' message and the principles He provides to you this morning, that you're not guarding your heart the way you ought to. Step out of the lie. Stop living a lie. Stop embracing hypocrisy in your life. And come to be mended. Understand the words of Jesus Christ, as insignificant as those sparrows are. I know even the hairs of your head. I know the most minute detail of your life. I know the things you struggle with, and I know how hard you try. Step out of your lie, and your reward in heaven will be great. Do you need to be mended of a lie this morning? If you do, come as you are. Though you may be broken, come to be mended by the only one who can do it.